All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Inclusive Practices, establishing a supportive school culture for all learners. My name is Marcy Wilburn, and I'm the project coordinator at the Indiana IEP Resource Center. We have some people coming in as we speak. So welcome to those who are just joining us. I appreciate you all being here today and joining us. I know this was a face-to-face session that we switched to virtual just in order to meet the needs of districts. We know it's hard to leave districts right now to find subs and that sort of thing. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. I'm going to start off just by saying that normally we do these virtual sessions in webinar. You will notice that we are in meeting this morning and all of your cameras are enabled. So if you want your camera on and you feel comfortable with that, go for it. If you prefer having your camera off, that is fine too. I just want you to know if you came in quickly and your camera's on and you don't want it to be on, turn it off, just so that you know. There's your fair warning. And again, I'm happy for you to leave them on if that's your preference, whatever you prefer. Also, your microphones, you have the ability to mute and unmute your microphone during this session. So if there is something that you want to share, feel free to do so. You can raise your hand feature and I can call on you, or please feel free to interject at any time. We want this session to be exactly what you need it to be, and I want you to get out of it what you're looking for. So please ask questions throughout. If you're uncomfortable muting or unmuting, I encourage you to participate via the chat. I do have it up on another screen, so I'll be trying to monitor that as closely as I can throughout the session. So that's available for you to interact within the session as well. For those of you who have a preference of utilizing closed captioning during the session, that is available for you. So you'll go down to the bottom toolbar and click on the closed captioning and go ahead and enable that to show up on your screen. So that is available if that's something that's of interest to you or you would like that. We will have a recording of this available following the session. So if anybody has to skip out early to get to a class or something like that, no problem at all. We will send out the recording after the session with the evaluation link as well. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started today. Again, welcome to those who are just now coming in. So by the end of this session, and we will end at 11:30 this morning, participants will gain knowledge and understanding regarding the research supporting inclusive environments, considerations for establishing and promoting a culture of shared responsibility and equitable access. And then we're going to dive into some practical strategies that you can use to promote success for all students. So we know what benefits our students with disabilities, in turn also benefits all students in the classroom. So we're going to talk about that. And then we will end with what specifically is necessary legally for students with disabilities, just so that you have that context leaving this session today. All right, again, who are we? We are the Indiana IEP Resource Center, and we are a state-funded grant through the Indiana Department of Education. And our goal really is to provide that training, technical assistance, and resource dissemination to educators across the state. Our ticket in the door most often is to work to improve outcomes for students with disabilities, but in turn, we're really looking to provide that good, high quality instruction that helps all students succeed. So who am I? My name is Marcy Wilburn, and I'm the project coordinator here at the center. If you look at this crazy picture over here, this is my crazy fam. And when you have identical twin boys who are all over the place and nutty, this is the best kind of picture that you're going to get. But this is a couple years ago. They're 5 and just started kindergarten now. I love to travel. I love chocolate and Diet Coke. That's how you can win me over. I have a bachelor's degree from Indiana State, a master's from Ball State, and I am a dissertation away from a doctorate at Indiana State as well. And as I said earlier, I work for the Resource Center. So now I want to know a little bit about who is here today. So we have a small group. So if you want to type in the chat your name and what your role is, or if you want to go ahead and unmute and share, that's fine too, whatever your preference is. But I just want to welcome you all. So go ahead and take some time and enter that into the chat. So Lindsay, what is your role? Special ed teacher. Thank you for being here. Olivia is a director. Welcome. Stephen, thank you for the wave.
Yeah, I'll speak. I'll be that guy.
All right. Hey, I appreciate that guy.
Yep, I figured you did. I know how this virtual teaching goes. I'm the 8th grade science teacher and lead, and I work with Olivia Tasketh, our special ed director, on kind of some general ed, special ed collaboration.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us. We love having those general ed counterparts in our meetings. It's so much more valuable doing this work together, and we're so much more effective.
100%.
So we have, is it Celia here with us today, special ed coordinator, case manager. Stephanie is a program coordinator at Down Syndrome Indiana and an in-source board member and a parent. Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. All right. I appreciate you all being here. So we've got stuff today. Let's use it. Normally our stuff would be in the form of handouts, but since we are in a virtual training, it is on our Padlet. So if you are interested in accessing this presentation later, or as I talk about different references and resources throughout the session, those are available on the Padlet. So you can get that one of two ways. You can go ahead and click on the Padlet link or type that into your browser, padlet.com/IEPRC/expanding inclusion. Or you can simply get out your phone. For those who are unfamiliar with QR codes, open your camera app and it should pull, you don't take a picture, you just open the camera app and hover over the QR code, and that should open up this Padlet for you. So whichever way works best for you, but that's where you're going to be able to access the materials from today's session. All right, we are going to start with an activity. So again, you're going to need your phone or open a browser on your computer. And I really want you to think about what words or phrases would you use to describe an inclusive culture. And you can do this one of two ways. You can go to menti.com and enter that 8-digit number. So 89797297. Or you can hover over and do this on your phone. But just any words that come to mind that make you think of inclusive culture. And we're going to kind of see what everybody's thoughts are and what our starting point is for today's session. All right, we did have an additional attendee just join, so really quick with the directions again. We are talking about what words or phrases you would use to describe an inclusive culture. So you can go to menti.com and enter the 8-digit code, or you can hover over and do the QR code. I'll give you a couple minutes and we'll see what comes up. Just 1 second while I get the screen up. Sorry about that. All right, give me a thumbs up in the chat if you can see the words popping up on the screen.
We can just see you very large now, like we can't see the screen you had up.
That is so depressing, Olivia. Thank you for the heads up. Let me fix that for you all. Get back to my Zoom window. How's that look? Is that better?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you, Stephen and Olivia, for the feedback. I appreciate that. So what words or phrases would you use to describe an inclusive culture? Belonging, everyone, collaboration's really big. So several people put that. We have scaffolded learning, a shared vision, working together. It's empowering for people. It's motivating. Everyone's included, without boundaries. I like that one. Accepted, interactive, welcoming, proud, liberating, unintended bias. Okay, so we have some side effects of that as well. So all these positive things, but there are barriers that we have to overcome when we're talking about inclusion. Community, shared vision. You'll see it very small in the middle, but I think it's really important. All, what do we mean by the word all? It's definitely something we're going to consider today. Equity, so talking about the difference between what's equal and what's equitable. Definitely. All right, thank you guys for sharing your thoughts on inclusion. Let's get back to the PowerPoint. All right, so now I'm going to give you some time to view a video on the evolution of inclusion. So we'll go ahead and kick this off now.
Welcome to 5 More Minutes, useful videos in 5 minutes or less that support the teaching and learning of all students. I'm your host, Shelly Moore. Today's topic is the evolution of inclusion. Okay, so you remember the dots? I know. I've shown you these before. But one colleague of mine suggested to me once, he goes, what if we didn't look at these as different concepts that we compare to each other, but instead as an evolution of time? It was totally brilliant. Now we could look at this timeline through the lens of any marginalized population, but to understand this timeline from the inclusion and disability perspective, we have to go back in time a little bit. Many of us know or are connected to someone who experienced institutionalization. It was even recommended to families by doctors. Although British Columbia was the first province in Canada to close down their institutions, there are still individuals living in these conditions across Canada today. The institutionalization movement is an example of exclusion. It separated individuals with disabilities from their families without choice. But the disability rights movement over the past 50 years, with the hard work of some incredible self-advocates and families, and maybe a little help from Geraldo Rivera, pushed communities to shift so that individuals of all abilities were welcomed and living in the same settings as their family and friends. This shift from institutions to communities, this was the start of the inclusive evolution. We have movement, but can we do better? Although many individuals are no longer excluded from their families and communities, they were, and let's be honest, they still are, expected to attend segregated schools or self-contained special education programs that are totally separate from the rest of the school community. And so parents started to ask some very good questions. You see, children with disabilities have siblings without disabilities, and families wanted all their kids to have equitable access to community-based education together. Kids started to be integrated into classrooms with their peers. They're in math together. They're in gym class together. They're eating lunch together. Kids are together. This is better. The shift from segregated to integrated schools and classrooms, this is the next step in the evolution of inclusion. We have movement, but can we do better? Well, this is where things get tricky, because integration, it doesn't take long to realize that just being together, it's not enough. Although in the same classroom, students with disabilities are often just that. They're physically in the classroom. They may sometimes have parallel activities, but mostly it's loosely connected classroom tasks. Now, you don't need me to tell you that just physically sharing space and time is enough to make you feel like you belong in a community. I mean, come on, there are Disney movies made about this. Breathing the same air is not enough. Do you remember the Titans? I do. The evolution from integration to inclusion is now the topic of many conversations in communities and schools around the world. How do we support individuals to be meaningfully included and not just physically integrated? It's not just about where kids go in their day, but why. What is the purpose to the places that they go? It's now school-based teams and staff that are asking questions about how to do this. How can we support purposeful and meaningful placements for kids with disabilities? In inclusive classrooms and schools, students aren't just present, but they have roles and responsibilities in their classrooms and also meaningfully connecting to their peers. This is inclusion. So there you have it, my friends. A brief history of inclusion in about 5 minutes. If this is interesting to you, though, definitely investigate your local history as well, because every community is in a different place in this journey, and it's so valuable to know where we've come from. The other thing, though, is looking at these visuals as a timeline. It really helped me to shift my own thinking from which bubble am I at or not at, and shift to more about where are we now in our inclusive journey and what's our next step. All of a sudden, the goal of inclusion becomes action-oriented and just feels so much more possible. We may not all be at the same place in the journey, but we can all move forward. We can do better. And so this is the question I'm going to leave you with today. Can we still do better? Do you think there's another evolution in inclusion? What might that be? How can we inch even more forward to make inclusion even better? Thanks, Geraldo.
So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Shelley Moore, but if you're not, I would highly recommend you write down this website on the screen, 5moreminutes.com. She is wonderful and has a plethora of short, sweet videos just like that, that really challenge your beliefs in the way you feel about educating students with disabilities and what that should look like. So if that's something of interest to you, please write this down. All right, you should be on my PowerPoint at this time, so let me know if you're not. But let's talk a little bit through about Shelley was talking about with the evolution of inclusion. So she is saying that we started with Geraldo Rivera, and the reason that he's documented within this video is he was the one who went out and did documentaries on some of these institutions that individuals with disabilities were living in the time, and really talked about the conditions that they were in and how it really wasn't a humane way to be and way to live, and really shed some light on that. And then she talked about, okay, well, now we're going to start having students with disabilities come to school, but in a segregated type setting. And that still happens today. We still have those self-contained settings for students. And sometimes that's where our building is at. But our goal is to shift to more inclusion along the way and celebrate that success as we move more towards students being included in the classroom. So then we have students who are integrated, they're in the classroom, but maybe they're not having meaningful access to curriculum. Maybe they're just present. So when we talk about, going to lunch, if there's not that connection with peers, just because they're in the same space, isn't meaningful to them. So how do we make that more meaningful? So we move from that integration piece really to being a member of that community and of that classroom. And then Shelley even challenges inclusion to, she teaches classes at a university in Canada, and she was challenged by one of her students in her class to talk about, you're showing these pictures with all of the, oh, I didn't include them, sorry. You're showing these pictures with all of these dots of students within the video where there are all these green dots and then these colorful dots are integrated into this. Well, the green dots are standing for our typical learners, but what the student challenged her and said was, you know what, we're not all green. We all have our strengths, we all have our weaknesses, we all come with differences that should be celebrated, whether that's learning differences, cultural differences, just beliefs and differences of where we come from. And so she's saying that really every dot should be a different shade. And that's when we get to that point and all of those differences are celebrated, then that's true inclusion. And that's what we're striving for. So everyone is at a different point in their journey. So I challenge you throughout this presentation to really think about where are you personally in your beliefs on inclusion? And then where is your school and district on their beliefs of inclusion? Inclusion is not a place. It's not an inclusion teacher. It's really a philosophy and a culture. So think about where you're at and really what are those look-fors of inclusion? What are those beliefs that are in place that we can say, yeah, we're on the right track, or maybe we need to revisit some things and do some things differently. So again, I think Shelley Moore does a great job just describing where we've been in the past and then where we really want to strive to be in the future. So what is inclusion? It's that equity and access piece. Do I have any brave volunteers who either want to unmute or type in the chat and really tell me what the difference between equal and equitable is?
Good morning.
Good morning,
When we look
Olivia.
at equal, we're looking at making everything the same for everyone. So when I think of equal, I think, well, if you wear glasses, then we all take our glasses off. But when we're looking at making something equitable, we're creating it so that everyone has that access at their need level. So if I need to wear glasses, then I can wear glasses. It's almost like we're not taking a crate and putting it under your feet to help you look above the fence. We're making the fence clear so that you can see what I see where you are at.
Absolutely. And that's one of those famous visuals when we talk about equality versus equity. So when we're talking about equal, we're talking about the same for everyone. When we're talking about equity, we're talking about what people need when they need it. And that is a big part of inclusion. It's allowing people to have what they need when they need it and fading it out over time when it's no longer needed. That is what equity is. So when you have those students who say, well, that's not fair, they're only doing this. Well, you know what, it's not fair in this class. It's not equal. It is equitable. We give people what they need. And sometimes you need a little bit more, and sometimes Johnny needs a little bit more. And we're going to make sure that we support people where they're at. And that's part of building that sense of community in your classroom. So giving people access to that curriculum is so important. Even if they're not necessarily at that level, scaffolding supports to hopefully raise them to that level. Exposure is important. Who am I as a teacher to say, I'm not sure that Johnny's going to meet that level, so we're not going to give him that level yet. Make sure they have exposure to that content that's available. We're not just putting kids in classrooms and dumping and hoping that they get it. We're supporting them along the way. And I know I'm preaching to the choir on that. We need to figure out what those supports are for all students within our buildings. Creating that sense of community and belonging for students, and really helping our students understand that we are here to support people through our strengths and weakness. And how can we do that? Really not sticking a student in the gen ed classroom with a one-on-one untrained aide. When we think about aides within the classroom, trained or untrained, they can be very beneficial, but we want to make sure that they're helping all students within the classroom, not attached to the side of one student all the time. When you have an aide who is with one student all the time, that can be, create dependence over time, whether that be on academics or even functioning needs of that child. But it can also be a problem with a social hindrance when they're unable to maintain good relationship with peers because there's always an adult in the middle of that situation. So just consider that. I know that some students have higher needs and might need an aide with them, but teaching that aide that there are times when that student can be independent, and we need to foster that independence for students. We definitely want inclusion to have educational benefit for the students and not just putting them in the classroom, as Shelley Moore explained. Creating independence and interdependence, not just that line of sight inclusion. Oh, it looks like they're all in there. What are we doing to foster that independence and interdependence for students? And really, like I talked about, culture and philosophy that all students can learn. We're not just moving students into the gen ed environment because we need more 50s for least restrictive environment. So all of you SPED directors who get your LRE numbers and think, oh, we need more 50s. We don't just want to move kids to make the numbers work. We want to make sure that they have the services and supports that they need to learn within the classroom. And again, I appreciate Stephen being here because it really is breaking down the silos between gen ed and special ed, and that collaboration piece, as you all said before in the Wordle, it's that collaboration of making people work together in order to benefit our students. We as educators, we definitely bring our strengths and areas that we can improve upon to the classroom. So why not put heads together to benefit our students and not build walls between different organizations? And that means sharing of resources, sharing of people, sharing of materials, sharing of space, making sure that we're doing what's best and not just thinking about the program that we were hired for. And sometimes that means redefining roles a little bit to make that work for the current circumstance that we're in. All right, so I'm not going to dive too deep into the research base, but I recognize that sometimes when we're talking about inclusive practices and we are working with individuals who maybe don't have that belief system, who aren't there yet in their journey to inclusion, that data speaks volumes. Research is important and numbers are important. So what I provided for you is just an overview of what the research says. But when you go into the Padlet, there is an entire column on research that has the articles that really I pulled this information from. So if you have someone who's kind of that pushback and saying, oh, this can't possibly work, it's not going to work for our kids, and I just don't think that can happen, or I can't possibly serve all the students within the same classroom with such diverse needs, because there is going to be some pushback on that. I think we can point to the research and say, look, not only do academics improve, but behavioral outcomes improve as well. And here's the information that says that not just one study, but multiple studies say that it's good for all students, not just students with disabilities, but it's good for all students. So I think that if you have some of that pushback, being able to have knowledge of the research is important, but I know you all as educators are really looking for what are the practical things that I can do. So we're going to get into that as well. why is this important? So it's important because it's in Indiana's ESSA plan, and it's important first and foremost because it's what's good for kids, right? But I think that when we're looking at this graphic is something that the Department of Ed Office of Special Education created, that we're really looking for that equity and access piece to improve outcomes for all. And we're going to do it through shared responsibility, shared accountability, high expectations. And then we have to work to collaborate, provide high quality instruction, good curriculum, and assessment that we are looking at that data and determining where to move next with our students. And then you'll see the overarching outside of the circle, universal design for learning is a framework we're going to dive into a little bit today. And then multi-tiered system of support is another framework. So all of those Office of Special Education created this graphic, and overall the department was really fond of it and thought, that's more than just students with disabilities. So they included it in the ESSA plan for all students. So it's not something that is important to the IEP Resource Center or important to Marcy Wilburn. Though it is, it's definitely something that's being pushed across the state as well. So when we're talking about inclusion, know that this is not a single district endeavor. This is a statewide endeavor that we're really trying to include students in our classrooms and make sure that they have equity and access in order to close that gap between where students who are at risk, where students with disabilities are, compared to their peers in their classroom. So where do we start with this? We've had a little bit of the research. We know why it's important and why we're moving in this direction, but where are we going? The first thing that you definitely have to look at when we're talking about an inclusive culture and inclusive practices is really these foundational beliefs. And as I said, people are at a different place in their journey. Individual educators are at a different place, and districts and schools might be in a different place. You might have a school who's in a very different place than the rest of the schools within their district. So you really have to gauge, where are people in their beliefs? And when I go through these beliefs, I think that it's important to note that if posed the question, do you believe that every child learns and achieves the high standard? All of us want to raise their hands. Like if I'm in a group training of 50 people and I ask this question, people are like, yeah, I agree with that. But I think we need to really dive into, what does every mean? And do their practices and what they're doing, their actions, really support that this belief of every child learns and achieves to high standards. So what are these look-fors that we might see in buildings when we're talking about these beliefs? So I'll give a little example as I go through each one. Every child learns and achieves to high standards. When we're talking about every child, if we have separate spaces where students with disabilities are educated, like our resource rooms or our self-contained classrooms, do we have learning objectives or learning targets posted on the wall for those students? Do they know what they're learning today? What does their day look like? And how do we teach them, this is what you're expected to do today? What do those high standards look like? When students are integrated into the classroom, in the gen ed environment, what is the expectation of those students to complete the work? Is it, oh, this is hard for you, so you don't have to do that? No, how do we scaffold those supports to get them to do that? So what does that look like when we say every child learns and achieves to high standards in a building? The next one is learning includes both academic and social competencies. And this is a big push from that MTSS framework, but we're not just improving the reading, writing, and mathematics of students. We're really looking at, how do they get along with each other? How do they treat each other and respect each other? How are we teaching them appropriate behaviors? Because what might be appropriate in their home and what is appropriate in school might look very different. How do we teach them the appropriateness for a school environment, which will one day be their work environment, and give them those skills? So we're not just teaching the reading and writing and the math, we're teaching those social competencies as well, and those relationship pieces that are so important for our students to be successful over time. Every member of the education community continues to grow, learn, and reflect. So again, dissecting that word every, what does that mean? We know that we have teachers who oftentimes get to attend professional development like these, but are we training our paraprofessionals in the professional development that's taking place? Do they have the skills that they need? Are we training our administrative assistants? students walk into the building and they might have a good rapport with those administrative assistants. How do we get them to help form those relationships with students? One of my favorite examples of this is bus drivers. How are we helping them to understand our students? They're the first ones to see them when they get on the bus in the morning, and they're the last ones to see them at the end of the day. So they have some pretty good insights on these students and how we might need to better support them. Number 4, every member of the educational community is responsible for every child. So it's not, oh, here's the special education students or your students, and here's my students, the gen ed students. Make sure that the common languages, these are our students. Another thing is that 5th grade teacher, one day she's going to have those kindergarten students. So why not work now to develop relationships and rapport with those kindergarten students as she passes them in the hallway, saying hi, starting to know who they are, recognize them by name, and starting that relationship early on. So by the time they're 5th graders, they already feel comfortable with him or with her. Anna said students that we share, absolutely. Making sure that we have this language of these are all of our students or students that we share. It's not one person's responsibility. It's that sense of shared responsibility across. So the beginning of the work is really the foundational beliefs work, and making sure that these 4 beliefs are foundational and they're established within your school or district. If not, then I think it's considering how do we start working towards this? And I think some of the ways to start working on beliefs is you have those champions who already are aligned with these 4 beliefs. Probably many of you on the call are aligned with these 4 beliefs, but how do you show success so that others can see that success and then start to replicate that in their rooms? And then once they start to feel the success, it's kind of like that ripple effect where it can grow bigger. But justifying the concerns of others and helping them work through some of those barriers and concerns, because it's not easy work. No one said it's going to be easy, but education's not easy. Teaching's not easy, whether we have these foundational beliefs or not. So this is, if you're not there yet, this is where we want you to be. And that's how I would communicate it to those within my district or school. We want you to be thinking and moving towards these 4 foundational beliefs. And I think it's so important to teach that whole child approach when we're talking about inclusion. We have the triangles for everything, right? And we're talking about this, that bottom tier is really what we're doing for all kids, that tier 1. Tier 2's, targeted, we have some interventions. And then we have that 5% who need that intensive support that they need, but they don't need that intensive support all the time. So sometimes when we go into districts, we hear, oh, the tier 2 students. We don't want them to be tier 2 students. You're not there all the time. You have a single deficit skill area that requires you to have additional support. So you're not a tier 2 student, you're a student receiving tier 2 services. So again, vocabulary is important. It's not a life sentence if you're in one of these tiers. I think the next slide does a really good job of just showing where kids can potentially be at any given time. So we look at this, and Stephen, I'm going to call you out for a minute because I think you'll be okay with it. If I'm talking to Stephen, if you don't mind either unmuting or in the chat, Stephen, tell me something that you're really good
at. Like just in general or within education?
In general.
I think probably this kind of is professional as well, but it's maybe helped me socially. I think I'm pretty good at building relationships. I'm starting to learn how to professionally use that in the workplace. And it sometimes got me into trouble when I was younger because I was socially focused, but I'm pretty naturally good at just forming those connections with people without being super deliberate about it, I would say.
Nice. So when we're talking about Stephen specifically, and we're talking about his ability to form relationships with others, he is not needing additional support. He falls in that universal tier. He doesn't need anything extra that we wouldn't give every other student in our classroom. He doesn't need that at this time. It's something that he's excelling at. Now, Stephen, if you don't mind me asking, what's something that's a little more difficult for you?
Staying focused on the problem or situation at hand. I'm very scatterbrained. I don't mind sharing. I'm like super adult ADD, and it can be difficult, particularly as a teacher, when it's like, okay, I got to grade for 3 hours and focus on this. It takes me like all evening to get it done.
Okay. So Stephen has learned about himself that when we're talking about attention and staying on task, he's going to need at least some additional supports, maybe in that targeted area. And there might be something that he needs even more intensive supports on, and that would be in the top, that intensive support category in that red area. However, Stephen's not always in the red category. He fluctuates, right? And probably even on his attention based on interest and his ability level, whether he likes it, he might be targeted. And some days, if it's really hard for him, then it's going to be that red intensive, and we're going to have to provide that level of support. So kids are all over the place. Humans are all over the place when we're talking about the level of need that they need for the different activities, the different skills that they have, and we need to provide that over time. And it really needs to be supporting when they need it and fading out when they don't need it, and making sure that it's fluid. But we're looking at the child as a whole, and not just a child as a student with a reading disability who's really struggling and they always need intensive support, because that's not the case. I bet if we dig down deep and figure out, hey, this student has trouble decoding, but if I read aloud to him, he can really comprehend. And that's an area of strength for him. So as long as it's a read aloud, then he's in that bottom category. And we need to figure out what students' strengths are and what their areas of needs are, and support them in the time that they need it, not just put them in these supports all the time because they definitely need supports for everything that they're going to do, because that's not the case for any student or any individual with whom we're working. I like this slide. We work with Leanne Young quite a bit, and she also is one, like Shelley Moore, who really challenges the belief of your thinking around serving students with special needs and students who are struggling learners. But she really talks about the false dichotomy of students who are eligible to receive services versus students who just have needs. So the boy on the left is a student who has a reading disability. He is a fourth grade student who struggles and has struggled since kindergarten. He qualified and he's eligible. He has an IEP, and we have case conferences annually. We progress monitor, we see if he's making progress, and we have conversations how to best support him and provide him the services that he needs to be successful. But then we have the student on the right who's also a fourth grader who struggles with reading, but he didn't qualify. He just missed the mark, but he still has similar needs of the student on the left. So Leanne, I think she says it best when she says, we have a legal obligation. An IEP is a legal document, and we have a legal obligation to serve the student on the left. But we have a moral obligation to serve the student on the right. And just because one is eligible for services and one is not, we need to make sure that we're providing them what they need in the time that they need it, just like that triangle that we just talked about. So that being said, is really another reason to break down those silos between gen ed and special ed and best use our resources to support all the learners within our classroom. And when we have an inclusive model in effect, we are able to do that more efficiently and provide the supports for all of our students. So students with disabilities don't have special needs, they have special rights. All students have varying needs. So how are we going to meet the needs of all the learners? So these are those practical strategies I was alluding to before. The first thing that we consider is really systems level work. So when we're talking to our directors and our coordinators on this call, really thinking about multi-tiered system of support. Again, this is something that's written in ESSA. So it is something that your district should be considering moving towards. And it's not a quick overnight process. It's something to think about over time and work on. And my guess is that as I go through each of these categories of multi-tiered systems of support, you have many of these things in place already. It's just putting them all under this umbrella in one coherent system as opposed to fragmented silos across the way. So the first one is leadership. This is the first domain of multi-tiered system of support. And when we talk talk about leadership, we need a leadership team who's going to guide this process. It's important on the leadership team that you have both representation from general education and special education, and you have leaders who have the ability to be decision makers within the district. So sometimes we have educators, boots on the ground. We want to hear their voice in these meetings, but we want those voices to influence the decision makers in some of the conversations that we have and best ways to move, whether that be policies, practices, what's in place to inform those decision makers who have the power to say, yes, this is what we're going to do, or that doesn't seem right for us at this time because this is what the data says. So you need a good leadership team who's meeting on a regular basis and having these conversations. The leadership team needs to have an understanding of what multi-tiered system of support is. They have to have some training because they're leading this effort within the school system. Then you have this capacity building infrastructure. So really that is making sure that our teachers have the knowledge base and the skill base in order to navigate a multi-tiered system of support. So we have to have information on, okay, multiple tiers of instruction intervention. What does that mean? What types of data do we need to collect? How do I fit within the system? How does my role fit within this system? So making sure that they are aware and have the training and the skills, and even beyond training, really that coaching piece to make sure that it's enabled over time. Communication and collaboration is important, as it is with all stakeholders. So definitely our administrative district level individuals need to be aware of what's taking place. Our building level individuals need to know what's taking place. Also our parents, our families, our community members, what's taking place within our building, and really what does our data look like? We're working really hard and here's where we're at, and we want to show off all of the good things that we're doing. And if it's not working, what are some changes that we're working towards to make sure that we're improving outcomes for students overall? So communication and collaboration is a big part of that multi-tiered system of support. The problem solving process, which next week I'm doing a training in Indianapolis around the problem solving process, but it really is there a process for analyzing data? So district level administrators are looking at different data sets than building level administrators, than teachers. But the process for looking at that data can be very similar. So you might be looking at the 4-step problem solving process, and there's many problem solving processes, and you may have one adopted within your building. But is there a protocol and process in place as you're reviewing data that lets us know, okay, we are effective, maybe we need to continue this route, we are ineffective, maybe we need to change, or we're ineffective, maybe we need to implement with fidelity because we haven't been doing it as it was intended, and then moving on from there. So definitely having a process outlined. So when we're looking at data, we're looking at it similarly across the district and not differently for each building or each classroom. We have a process in place. When we think of MTSS, typically we think of the multiple tiers of instruction intervention. That triangle immediately comes to mind, and this is a big part of it. But all of these other factors feed into this. So when we're talking about that tier 1, are 80% of our students successful in the general education curriculum? And if so, we're doing pretty well in our tier 1 category. And then we need to focus on our interventions for tier 2 and tier 3. If we don't have success at around 80% at that tier 1 level, then maybe we need to go back and look at what we're doing at tier 1 and make sure that it's effective. We worked with a consultant years ago who said you can't intervene your way out of bad core instruction. And I think that's exactly right. We want students to have good access to the core. And if they're successful there, then we're going to provide, or if they're unsuccessful there, then we're going to provide those interventions. If they're having poor core and we just keep slapping interventions on top of the poor core instruction, there's not enough time in our day to close that gap. They have to have good core instruction, 90-minute reading blocks, 60-minute math blocks, whatever that looks like for you within your district. That has to be the best of what they're getting. And that's going to impact the majority of students. And then those who are not successful at that level, we're going to provide additional supports too. The important things about the tiers is knowing when to move in and out of the tiers. And though sometimes teacher observation and perception data is important, we definitely want to depend on the data. So looking at the last domain of MTSS is really that data evaluation piece. It's making sure that teachers have access to the data that they need, buildings have access to the data that they need, and districts have access to the data that they need. So can I get my hands on the data? Number one. Number two, once I have access to the data, do I understand what it means? I need to make sure that I have understanding of how to read that data. What does that NWA score mean? What does that Ames Web data mean? What are our benchmarks for our students? Where should our students be? Where is my student at? And what does that gap look like? What is good progress over time? What should it be? Making sure that we have those conversations and we're building that capacity for teachers in the area of data evaluation. So these are all integrated. They overlap often, but these 6 domains are what makes a successful multi-tier system of support. You can't have multiple tiers of instruction and intervention without the data evaluation piece. You'll never know when to move kids in and out of tiers. So again, you need all of these parts to make it a successful multi-tiered system of support. So where do services and supports fit within an MTSS framework? So when we're talking about services and supports, it could be anything from special education to ELL services to gifted and talented services. And the answer is they are in every single tier. It is not special education is this cloud of a bubble outside the triangle. So once you're in special education, you're no longer going to receive MTSS supports. No, you're integrated within the triangle. You're a part of it. You should see special education for some of our students in tier 1, that co-teaching support. That's what it should look like. Or, something similar where a pair is supporting in the classroom. Tier 2, you might have special education supports that are more intensive. And then tier 3, you might have special education supports that are even more intensive. But that could happen for any services and supports that we provide along the way, not just special education. But they are throughout the tiers and they should be evident in multiple aspects of our building environment. The next one that I want to talk about after multi-tiered system of support is really that differentiated instruction piece. And I love this quote by Christina Dubé talking about good teachers have always recognized and responded to the inherent diversity in the classrooms. We have students with differences. We have heterogeneous groups of students, and we're going to work together to meet their needs. They know that the content and skills that they're using to teach may or may not work with the students that they're serving. It is definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach. We know that that's ineffective. So we have to differentiate for our students. So we are going to look at the students that we're serving and figure out how do we better meet their needs. And here's ways that we can do that. So we're going to make sure that we want our learning to be effective. And it's definitely something where we're looking at the content, the process, the product, and the environment when we differentiate. It is not just a bag of tricks or a set of strategies that we can just plunk in whenever. We definitely need a good core curriculum. And once that's in place, if they're not getting the core, then we add in those differentiations. But again, going back to that good tier 1. Regularly examining evidence of student learning. So we're looking at where are they at and then making those decisions. Assessments are intended to inform our instruction later. So after we do the assessment, what are we going to do to change? How are we reflecting back on what we're doing? It is not something that you need to do every single moment of every single day. Don't be overwhelmed with differentiation, but it's also not something you're going to do once a month either. So think about what's taking place in your classroom and the students' needs that you're serving and how are we differentiating to meet those needs. You're really looking at tailoring that instruction, designing this respectful task and using flexible grouping. So you might have students who really struggle in one skill area and you're going to take them and work with them. But the next time it might be something that they're really good at and you're going to integrate those students back into either the whole group or another small group for enrichment. So the groups are ever changing. They should not stay the same. You're really looking at that data to inform the groups with whom you're working. A way for standards and learning goals to be improved over time. You want to work up to those goals, not to avoid them completely. So we talked about, meaningful access to the curriculum. If you're in here and it's hard for you, we're not going to say, oh, you don't have to do this worksheet today. It's going to be, how can we get you there? What scaffolds and supports can we put in place to get you to the point that you need to be to do it? It really is improving instruction for all students, because what we find is when we provide those scaffolds and supports for the students who are struggling, sometimes that benefits our other learners as well. And it's not just looking at our students with disabilities and our English language learners. It's looking at that entire classroom community and who needs it at what time. So classroom community is important. This is integrated throughout inclusive practices, making sure that everyone has that sense of belonging and is a full member of the classroom community. And how do we create that for students? Making sure that we're articulating learning goals so students know where we want them to be at the end of the lesson. We're assessing over time, we're looking at that data, and we're determining how to best meet the needs of our group based on their readiness, their interest, or their learning preferences. When we talk about content, it's the what we're teaching. When we talk about process, it's the how we're teaching. When we talk about product, it's what students are producing to show us what they know. And when we talk about environment, it's how is the environment conducive to the learning of that student. So you might have to change seating arrangements or things like that to best meet the needs of the learners within your classroom. But those are all considerations for differentiation and how you can potentially change. I will let you know that starting next fall, we are doing a series with Christina Dubé all about differentiation and how to integrate that into your classroom. It's a book study, so it's an entire year-long commitment of a book study with a few 5 or so meetings throughout the year. So if this is of interest to you and you want to learn more of that, be on the lookout for that. Again, that will take place fall of next year, but we're excited about that new relationship and partnership with her. The next one that I like to pair with differentiation, because oftentimes people get the two confused, is universal design for learning. And though they are very similar, we'll talk about kind of how they're different and how both are effective in the classroom. So it's really the 3 pillars or principles based on the science of learning. And the principles guide the work that is effective and inclusive for all learners. When we're looking at UDL, we have these 3 pillars: multiple means of engagement. Why am I learning this? Multiple means of representation. What am I learning? How's the teacher conveying that information to me? What's that input? Multiple means of action and expression. So the how of learning, how am I showing you what I know? So those are the 3 categories of UDL. And I always mention this in trainings because I think it's so important. Multiple means of engagement used to be the last pillar, and they moved it towards the beginning, because if you're not engaged in the content, then you're not able to truly gain the input or be able to express the output unless you're engaged in what you're learning. So how are we really tapping into the interest of students and making them want to learn and making them become those expert learners? Because that's the intent of UDL. If you are not familiar with UDL, CAST.org, CAST.org has so many really videos, articles, resources, research, all available to you. This has to be one of my favorite charts that I have pulled off CAST.org that really breaks down the pillars into an easy, understandable way. So if this is something that you're sharing with teachers across your district, I would print these off. They're very easy to find on the homepage at CAST.org, but really helping them understand that provide multiple means of engagement is really looking at recruiting interest for students, sustaining effort and persistence. So when it gets hard, how are we going to make sure they persevere and get through? And then self-regulating. So how do we make sure that they know when they're understanding? They know when they don't understand. They know when they're off task. They know when they're on task. How do we pull them back in? Because our goal under that engagement category is to make sure that our learners come out purposeful and motivated. They have a want to learn. They are curious learners and they want to continue that over time. That is that engagement strand. Then that representation is, this is what the teacher's doing. And we need to make sure that we have options for perception. How are students gaining that information and perceiving the information that we're giving it to them? Do we offer it visually? Do we offer it auditorily? How are we providing that information? Are we using language and symbols so that they understand the context in which we're speaking? And are they comprehending? Are they understanding the information that we're sharing with them? And the way that we represent the information causes students to be both resourceful and knowledgeable. And the last one is that action and expression piece. This is what the students are doing to show what they know. Are they physically showing what they're doing? Are they expressing it and communicating it, whether that be in writing or just telling you? And what are their executive functions? How can they set goals for their learning next time? It's important for them to know, here's where I'm at now, and here's where I want to be. And that creates learners who are strategic and goal directed. So this is really looking at, how do we create learners who know how they learn, who know what works for them and what doesn't work for them, and providing options at the elementary, middle school level for them to explore what works for them and maybe what doesn't. And then at some point, you know, in the high school years or late middle school years, we want them to start taking this on, especially for our students who have specific accommodation. This works for me, this doesn't work for me. And how do they self-advocate to get that? And same with our other learners who don't necessarily have those specific accommodations in the classroom. It would really help me if you did blank. They need to be able to communicate that with their teachers. And that's easier said than done. But if we start in the early grades and teach them that this is what works for you, ask for these things, they're going to be much more comfortable as they go into middle and high school. And then of course, in their adult lives as well. We all have things in these areas that we could work on and that we're really good at, but it's knowing the things that we struggle with and where we might need support and who could help us with those things. So again, UDL, the intent is to create expert learners, and it really happens on the forefront. You are designing these learning opportunities for anybody who might enter your door. And it's not reactive, whereas differentiation is more of, these are the students I'm serving, this is what the assessment says, and here's how I am going to plan for those students. So UDL is a little bit more proactive approach, differentiation is a little bit more reactive approach, but using them together is what's so important, because in UDL, if you've missed something along the way, then differentiation can help you make up for that and reach the learners that you are serving within your classroom. I think this quote sums it up really well. Broadly speaking, UDL suggests providing the entire class with multiple ways to represent, interact with, and show understanding of the content. With differentiation, specific avenues are provided to specific students or groups of students based on needs emerging from ongoing assessment. In best case scenarios, classrooms include both UDL and differentiation. And I will say sometimes that these terms are used interchangeably. But this happens to be that definition that we feel really captures the essence of UDL as that planning piece, and differentiation is, if they're not getting it, what are we going to do to ensure that they get it? So we're going to do a brief activity now, and hopefully my screens seem to be working well. So hopefully with this video, they will. But throughout the video, I want you to consider both differentiation and universal design for learning. So what you just kind of took in about those two concepts. And I want you to describe how the teacher in this classroom is meeting the needs of all the learners within her classroom. So for differentiation, you're going to be thinking about content, process, product, environment. And for universal design for learning, you're going to be looking at engagement. You're going to be looking at representation, and you're going to be looking at action and expression. And there's some overlap there, right? So as you're looking at this teacher's lesson, really dive into what she's doing for the success of all students. All right, we see a video. We're gonna play it. Give me a thumbs up, Alana, if we're good.
That is an opinion, but Daniel gets to share his.
I'm a word person. I feel great when we're all reading and discussing and writing papers. That feels super comfortable to me, but it's not successful for all my students. So I need to disrupt that for myself.
Now, right before we sample it, Mick, tell everybody, what is it that you need to be able to do by the end of class today?
I can describe the process of milk turning into yogurt through fermentation.
Okay. Here is a job that I need. I need every person in this room to get a plastic cup.
Within any single day, you'll have a variety of access points for the content. And I do find that it deepens engagement for gen ed kids, for special education kids, for all different kinds of students, because there's more to do. Like, we got to keep it moving, otherwise it gets really boring. So it's trying to find a way where there's something that's video, where there's something that's audio, where there's something that's visual, where there's something that's read. It is about that many paths, many paths.
Floating around. Nobody's connected to anybody else. Floating around. We're floating around. Now make 1 milk protein. 1 milk protein.
I really learned how important it was to introduce more visual cues for my students who are English language learners, where you do an action related to vocabulary or related to a concept.
We're going to stretch out, stretch out, stretch.
The learning gains that I saw for my ELL learners were so huge when I started to disrupt a purely language-based and word-based type of instruction.
But what do I want now? Connect. Connect. Connect.
It matters less to me how we arrive somewhere. What matters to me is that a student develops the conceptual understanding around something.
Get tiny, get tight, get small. You're a tiny, tight little milk protein.
I just saw my students really be able to shine. It was beautiful to watch.
Okay. And class.
All right, so let's go ahead and do this. If you will, for me in the chat, or if you're comfortable unmuting, share what you saw this teacher doing around differentiation or universal design for learning. What were the access points that she created in this content for students? Brave Stephen, thanks.
Yeah, I'm actually not brave. I don't feel like typing this morning.
Fair enough.
Well, I thought, this is like super obvious. They just kind of set it up and she's talking about it, but just all the different ways that she's providing instruction to the students, whether they're again, I feel like these terms are so outdated, but just like whether they're a visual learner or they need to hear it. I like how she said, she always has like a short little video. Then she has the students moving around and interacting with each other, obviously pre-COVID, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Olivia, Anna and I come from a school where we have a huge ELL population, and the part about using those like visual cues, and she said putting in action with the instruction, really supporting the ELL students, that really jived with me, because as a science teacher, I found like the more I can come up with any type of visual, any type of action-based thing, you just get so much better buy-in and mastery of the topic. So I just really using a variety of strategies so that if kids don't learn from one thing, they have 3 other things that will hopefully get through to them.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing, Stephen. And Olivia wrote in the chat, she taught using all modalities. She definitely did within the classroom, and she had tasks written on the board. So she offered it in 2 different modes. She represented the content differently so that different students could access the curriculum. Did you notice anything about the written task of the students in the classroom? And I've seen this 100 times, so I definitely, if you missed it, I understand. One of the students actually had a worksheet that was more of a graphic organizer type with probing questions, and then a larger space for her to write because that was her need. Whereas some of the students just had smaller lines for answering questions. So even it wasn't even modifying the curriculum. The content was the same, but the structure of the worksheet based on the students' needs looked different. So the way that it was organized for her writing need and her deficit. Anything that you were watching in here that you thought that might be able to, we could improve upon that in some way?
I really appreciated the fact that I couldn't necessarily identify which students had IEPs, right? Like they were all intermixed and together and doing all of the same things.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And you definitely would not know in this room. They're all doing, and I would argue that those visuals and those movements that were taking place across the classroom we're helping all kids remember the content for what a milk protein looks like, what's a molecule do, all of those things that students can struggle with. And I think she did a great job of providing that information. One thing that I noticed when I watched this video, there's so much greatness, and maybe it's just because they're not needed at this time. But I think she has a lot of support in her room. So you'll notice in the back of the room, or maybe you did or didn't notice, there were 2 adults sitting at a back table. And I don't know the roles of those adults. I don't know what their purpose was in the classroom, but I do think it would have been nice to see them up, moving around with her, like spread out. Like they're both kind of tucked in the back corner. And I don't know if that's just because during this lesson, everyone was engaged. They didn't need to, prompt anyone or anything like that. But if you have multiple hands in your room, utilize them. I mean, we don't want them just sitting there next to students. So I would definitely spread them out amongst the group and make sure that if there's small groups that need to take place or anything like that, that we're utilizing them in that capacity. And again, this is completely not knowing their roles and not knowing the intent of them being there, but just making sure that if we have the people, let's go for that and make the best use of them in the classroom. But again, she is amazing and does amazing things for students. And so many of the things that you guys saw within the classroom with her, just in that brief 3-minute video, think of all the different ways that students were engaged in the content. I mean, so many ways. And you just saw a fraction of what she's doing within the classroom. So a great example to show access points and in different ways that kids can access the content. You don't have to be a reader or a writer to do those movements. All of the students were able to do that and be exposed to the content that way. All right, the next strategy that we're going to talk about today is co-teaching. And when we talk about co-teaching, we have a lot of good co-teaching happening across the state. We're looking at these 3 definitions: co-planning, co-teaching, and co-assessing. So Murawski says that these 3 things have to be taking place for it to be considered co-teaching. And sometimes we miss out on the co-planning or the co-assessing piece. Teachers show up and they're in the classroom together, but maybe they didn't plan for that lesson together, or got a copy of the general education teacher's lessons plan the week prior, but there's no true roles defined on who's doing what during that co-taught lesson. And when we do that, we typically refer back to that one teach, one assist method, where the special ed teacher's kind of walking around. And so we really want co-teaching to move beyond that and look at these 3 parts of co-planning, co-teaching, and co-assessing. Co-teaching is really looking at the shared expertise of 2 professionals within the building. So we have general education teachers bringing their expertise, special education teachers bringing their expertise. I say those 2 roles because that's typically who's doing it, but please know that any licensed educator can co-teach with another. We definitely want the environment to be conducive to not only improving student outcomes, but also teacher success. We know that sometimes when we have 2 people working together, we're able to, 1, evaluate each other's teaching practices and what they're doing well and what they can improve upon within their teaching. And then looking at is the instruction that we're providing improving outcomes for students? And if not, how can we collaborate together to ensure that's happening? So it's not just about the students being successful, it's about the teachers being successful as well within the classroom. And then really going back to that culture philosophy piece that we talked about at the beginning, all students are full members of the class. So what does full mean? You would talk about that at a building or a district level. And how do we make sure that they all have this sense of belonging, whether it's in academics and meaningful access, or whether it's social and meaningful relationships. But what can that mean for our students to be full members of the classroom? So one thing that we always like to include within our co-teaching trainings is that co-teaching should be seen as a special education thing. It shouldn't be seen as a special education thing, but rather a best practice in education thing. So we have co-teachers that are coming together. Typically one's a special ed teacher, typically one's a gen ed teacher, and they're working to support all learners within the classroom. Someone said earlier, they are our students. They are shared students among the group. And that's really true in all settings, but specifically in a co-taught classroom. It is not, oh, special ed teachers, students go back to the kidney table. It really is, what do all kids need and how do we address that? Because it's really a general education thing where we're supporting as a special educator and a teacher in the classroom. We talk a lot about when we have co-teachers in the classroom, we have administrators paying two different people. And when they go into the classroom, they want to see something that is substantially different and better for the students than if one teacher was working alone. So if I have two co-teachers in the room and I'm paying two teachers to lead this class, it should look different. It should be very different. Then I shouldn't have just a teacher in the back of the room. They should be up and working with students. They should be hosting some small groups and facilitating learning of students over time. And I think that's so important. So as you have co-teachers within your building, when they're creating those lesson plans and kind of divvying out those roles and responsibilities for the classroom of that for that day's lesson, really thinking about how is this going to look different than what's taking place across the hall that isn't a co-taught classroom. So typically a general education teacher and a co-teaching relationship brings that curriculum expertise. So they are a master of the content. So they're going to bring that content knowledge with them. Whereas a special education teacher brings that specially designed instruction and any related expertise around accommodations, modifications, strategies to support learning. The general education teacher is used to managing an entire classroom, so they bring that group management. For special ed teachers who have been more pull out or resource before, they might have that focus on small group or individual students. Some of our special education teachers loop with students, so they have good relationships with students over time. So their focus is on that individual student. General education teachers bring pacing. They have knowledge of what's going to take place on that pacing guide. They know where they need to be at the end of the quarter in order to get through all of the content by the end of the year. Whereas special education teachers bring that mastery mindset because they want students to work towards those goals and continue to work towards those goals until they master those goals. And then we all work together. I think it's important to note that when we talk about this slide, that this is what special education teachers are bringing and general education teachers are bringing at the beginning of their relationship. These are the things that they might be the experts in when they come together. Really what their undergrad work was on, what their teaching license is in, right? They have expertise in these areas based on what they went to school for. But then when you come together, the longer that relationship is in place, these lines start to blur a little bit. And we talked on the definitions about teacher success. As a special education teacher, me in the room learning Algebra 2, I'm going to start to have that curriculum expertise over time because I'm teaching it day in and day out alongside that teacher. So over time, these lines will blur and the goal is to get there. But this is the expertise that you're bringing at the beginning of that co-teaching relationship or that teachers should be bringing at the beginning of that relationship. So here are the approaches that I'm going to run through rather quickly. One teach, one assist is really just that. One teacher teaching the entire group, and then one teacher assisting, going around helping students, whether that be academically or behaviorally, keeping them on task. One of the barriers to this is that if a teacher is working with a student in that one assist mode, that student, if it's longer than a couple seconds and it turns into minutes of time, they are now missing the content that the teacher leading the whole group is providing. So I think it's something to be careful of when we're always doing one teach assist, our students losing some of the content because they're always having that additional person next to them helping them. So again, this is a great approach to use in between other approaches. I would suggest that you have multiple approaches within a single lesson, never a whole class period would you be doing one teach, one assist. It's typically where people start out in the relationship before they really have a chance to get to know one another and to co-plan. This is where co-teaching tends to go in that one teach, one assist model. One teach, one observe is similar, but rather than assisting students, you're really observing for a purpose. So you're observing whether that be academic success of students or where students are struggling. Maybe you're determining what your groups might be for a later alternative teaching, like these 5 students were not getting the content during the whole group, so they're going to come work in the alternative teaching setting with me later. Or maybe you're tracking behavioral data. We have special ed teachers who are going to be tracking progress monitoring data. This is a good time for that. Sometimes we're even observing our teaching partner and what they're doing. So the observations can be student observations or teaching observations, but they need to be purposeful and planned. We need to make sure that when we are observing, we carve out time that on Fridays from the first 10 minutes of class, I'm going to be observing this. Because if it's not purposeful and planned, the observations typically don't happen. So we need to make sure that they're part of our plans and that we're doing that, even if it's a routine plan over time. Parallel teaching is taking the same content and teaching it in 2 smaller groups. So you have a teacher leading 2 groups. And with those 2 groups, the same content can be taught in the same way or in different ways, but it really provides more opportunities for students to respond. It's a smaller teacher to student ratio where they can work more in those small group settings with students to make sure that they're getting what they need. Benefits are relationships with students. Some students might work better for one teacher than the other, and that student would go in that group. Making sure that you have space in your room, thinking about noise and logistics and those types of things when we're talking parallel teaching. If you don't have space within your room, it is absolutely appropriate to take kids to a different space, assuming you're not wasting too much instructional time to do so, as long as the groups are fluid. You don't want to take the same groups and split the same groups up over and over again, especially if it's a group of special education students, because that could potentially change their least restrictive environment if they're all going with special ed kids all the time. They're no longer with their general education peers. So anytime we're talking about grouping or changing rooms or anything like that, they should be fluid groups and ever changing. Alternative teaching really is that model where you are able to really work more intensively with a group of students, whether that be like a pre-teach or a reteach or even an enrichment, typically with a smaller group, and then the whole group's doing something different. Now the whole group can't be teaching new content because then those students in the small group would be missing out. But if they're doing something similar like a review, that might be a great time for you to do some pre-teach or reteach work with students who are struggling a little bit more in a small group. Station teaching, we see it all the time at the elementary level. It tends to fade out in middle and high school, but I definitely think this is an approach that your co-teachers should be trying. When you go into the classroom and you see station teaching happening, typically there are 3 stations, 2 teacher-led stations and 1 independent station, or maybe it could be 1 teacher-led station and then 2 independent stations where the other teachers kind of floating through and answering questions to make sure that students are on task in the station that they're doing. That seems to be the best way to go if stations are new and you're really teaching those procedures of what stations look like. And then once it gets to be kind of flowing and students are more capable about being on task and staying in their group, then you might have 2 teacher-led stations. You just don't want to always leave your teacher's-led station to correct the behaviors of individuals at other stations. One thing to consider when planning for station teaching is the task cannot be dependent upon another. So they can't have to go to the teacher station first in order to move to station 2 because they're all going to be going through the stations at different times. So they really need to be not dependent upon each other and independent. Teaming would be both teachers up teaching the content to the classroom. And then one teach, one make multisensory is an additional approach that Paula Cluth talks about in her writing, but it really is a teaming approach where one teacher's teaching and the other teacher is really accessing a different sense. So for instance, I might be telling a story or telling the life cycle of a plant where another teacher is actually drawing the seed underneath the gravel and then drawing the stem up and the petals so that students are able to see that side by side. Sometimes when we see this, it might be one teacher's reading a story and the other teacher is acting out the story. And so it's just another way for students to access the content in the classroom. It's a creative and fun approach that some may not be familiar with. So I like to throw that one in here when we're talking about the co-teaching approaches. So then from here, what's required for students with disabilities? So students with disabilities in the classroom, remember, we have a legal obligation to those students. So they have to have the specially designed instruction within the classroom. So when they are included in the general education environment, we still need to determine when is specially designed instruction taking place. And this is the adapting of the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction to address the unique needs of the child. So regardless of what their disability is, we are still going to promote progress or ensure progress and access over time to the general education curriculum based on the specially designed instruction that we're providing. How do we know that it's specially designed instruction? We need to make sure it's aligned to their present levels and is specifically designed to address the goals within their IEP. Learning is going to occur regardless of their area of disability. We're using data to determine instruction and effectiveness. It needs to be research-based. It's systematic instruction, so it's planned, delivered over time. We're documenting it and evaluating it. So when we talk about, some of those co-teaching models, one teach, one observe, this might be a time where you are documenting that data and observing what's taking place in the classroom. The teacher leads the delivery of this instruction. It's needed by the student with the disability. Remember, students who are eligible to receive services, the specially designed instruction piece is what makes their education special education. So we need to make sure that they're receiving this. It addresses their learning deficits, and it really is looking at them working towards those grade level standards. It really is looking at the students' needs based on the domains, and then really that generalization of skills over time. Are they able to do it in this setting and extend it to a different setting over time? So we need to make sure that students who are included are still receiving their specially designed instruction. And how are we integrating that into the classroom? They also, if stated in their IEP, will have accommodations and modifications. So accommodations are changing the how the student learns. So it's really that leveling of the playing field. And when we're talking about modifications, we're changing the what, we're changing the content of what they're learning. We're changing that complexity of skills. So typically students who are included in the general education classroom, as we're looking at more mild disabilities, we'll have more accommodations that we're looking at. Are we providing a calculator? Are we reading the information to them? It's really looking at their disability and removing those barriers. When we're talking about modifications, we have a student who's farther below grade level, and we might need to change some of the content that we're teaching for that student. And that might look a little bit different than what the other students are doing in the classroom. It's still aligned with the general education curriculum, but the content and the complexity might be lower than what that of other students is doing. So we need to make sure that our students with disabilities are receiving their accommodations and, if needed, modifications. And that's all based on what their individualized education plan says. So now with our last 5 minutes, I really want to talk to you about where are you in your inclusive journey and where do you think that you could go next? So really that self-evaluation piece of this is where I am personally, and this is where my school is, and what ways could I improve? What are some of these practices we have in place? And what are some of these things that maybe we don't have in place that we could consider? I am by no means saying that all of the practices and strategies that we talked about today, you implement tomorrow. That is not the case. I would say pick one that maybe you're already doing and consider ways to improve that to really move to the next step in your inclusive journey. Or maybe if you're not doing some of these things, is there one that you might be able to look at or want to learn about a little bit more in depth to move forward in that inclusive journey that you're on? So I'm going to close out with these two quotes that I think are super powerful, and really it just empowers anybody to be able to start the inclusive conversations within a building. So once the process of creating an inclusive culture is put into motion by someone, even a second grade teacher, a custodian, a parent, or even the superintendent, we know that the inclusive mindset and practices can then grow exponentially. So you might be the one to be the change and be the start of this inclusive mindset and practices within your building. Going back to those beliefs and thinking through that, Where are you and where do you want other people to be? The work has to start with someone, and is that someone you? Followed by a quote by Shelley Moore: if we can now extend inclusive education to include every diverse learner, then we can also start to view inclusion as not something we simply do. Instead, it becomes something that just is. So I love this because I think when we can stop talking about inclusion, because all students are included, that's our ultimate goal. When we can stop having initiatives and strategies to promote it and we're just doing it. We're far from that, but I think that is a great goal to have when we're talking about inclusion and inclusive practices within our school. All right. Lastly, I just want to show you some books that I would recommend for improving culture. One Without the Other by Shelley Moore. Your Students, My Students, Our Students, Rethinking Equitable and Inclusive Classrooms by Leanne Young and others. These are both ones that really will stretch your thinking about educating all students within the general education environment and just really meeting the needs of all of our students. Then these are a couple of my new faves that I just stumbled upon on differentiation. So if differentiation is something that you want to dive into, Christina Dubé's books and Jessica Hockett's books. She has one both for elementary and for middle and high school. And sometimes our middle and high school teachers don't have those books dedicated to them. So this might be something that if you have teachers who are working on this or want to improve in this area, these are some great, very practical strategy type of books. And then a couple things on UDL. If you want additional support in UDL, the Patents Project is a wonderful resource for you. They have these laminated one-pagers that are great for introductory work, or if you are interested in consultants going in and assisting with Universal Design for Learning, they also have an AIM grant where districts can apply and work with them as well. So more information can be found on the Patents website. And then Universal Design Daily by Dr. Paula Kluth is an easy book of multiple ways to tap into each of the 3 pillars of UDL. Again, it just really gives you 365 ways to provide different activities to support all learners and really engage all learners within your classroom. So it's a great, quick book of easy, practical strategies to implement tomorrow. These are some of our faves on co-teaching. So Marilyn Friend does have her co-teach book. This is more of a textbook. So if you're just trying to get the background of the approaches, some of the research and that information, and then 30 Days to the Co-Taught Classroom is more of a workbook for your teachers to work through, really working on that relationship, lesson planning, co-teaching strategies, gives good examples for when to use those approaches and models, and then some co-assessing as well. Specially designed instruction. If you're looking for more information on that, we have a one-pager Spread the Word that I think is beneficial on our website. And then also specially designed instruction for co-teaching is a new book that's out by Marilyn Friend and Tammy Barron that is helpful as well. Are there any questions today? And it is right at the 11:30 mark. So if you don't have questions, and you're not able to stay on, I completely understand. If you could do me a favor before I take questions and either scan the QR code on the left to fill out the evaluation, or you can go to the web address, indianaiprc.org/eval. You will select this training from a drop-down and go ahead and evaluate the session. We really appreciate your feedback. We want to make sure that our sessions are meeting the needs across the state. So please give us additional information on what worked for you and what didn't work for you and how we can improve. Also, if you want to know more about other workshops, you can go to our website under the Professional Learning tab. And my contact information will be on the next slide, but I'll give you a couple minutes to get this down. All right, any questions for today while people are getting to the evaluation? Feel free to put them in the chat or unmute if that's more your style. I will give a little bit of wait time just to see if any questions pop up. But for those of you who don't have questions, I hope you have a great day. And thanks so much for joining me this morning and being flexible when we switched from face-to-face to virtual and back again. So thank you for that. If you need anything, My contact information is on this slide. Feel free to email me or call me if you're interested in the resources that we discussed today and need to figure out how to access those, or any additional training within your district or school on these topics. Please reach out and let us know. We would be happy to come out and work with you all. All righty. Have a great day. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Marcy. We appreciate it.
Thanks,
Have a good one.
Stephen. Have a good one.
Take care.
Alana, thanks for joining today. I appreciate it.
That was great. Thank you so much for letting me join.
Of course.